Day 5. Today we're going to start looking at hunger and fullness cues. And this is something when I'm working with clients, we work on consistently as we're working together because our eating patterns are so automatic and we do that. We eat without really thinking about it. If you think about what percentage of the food we eat, we actually remember eating, it's probably just those first few bites. So we eat very unconsciously. And we're going to explore that a little bit more today. And I'm a big believer that our culture's perception of hunger is flawed. We are taught from a very, very young age to ignore our hunger cues, and in some cases we're actually shamed and made to feel quite embarrassed if our tummies rumble or if we ask for food when we're hungry. So when you start to think about where does our attunement to our natural hunger start to get interrupted, very much it starts in childhood, and I talked a bit about that in the previous days. So there are a number of things that influence our attunement to our hunger, but diet culture and society's perception of what's beautiful certainly play their part. And I know even in my past, there have been times where I felt hungry and I've associated that hunger with losing weight, or I've associated those feelings of hunger as being a good thing in some way. And all the while we either just don't even recognise our hunger cues until they're sort of screaming at us, and by that point it's really hard to then resist grabbing something quick and something easy to eat. We're certainly not recognising our hunger when it's at a 3 or 4 or 5, and I'm going to talk more about the hunger scale, and it's going to be something that I invite you to explore and work on yourselves. So I know skipping meals, saving, diet culture kind of really encourages us to skip meals, although they will say eat regularly, but sort of there's an undercurrent in diet culture, certainly like with Weight Watchers and things like that, where they encourage you to count points. And I can very much remember both myself and ladies that I would, when I went to Slimming World, would be counting up or saving their sins for the weekend. So kind of food is food is a currency, isn't it? And it's interesting where we choose to save and where we choose to spend. And when we look at it just from a physical perspective, calories in and calories out, that kind of makes sense. But actually when we start to look a little bit broader and we actually start to look at what is driving this self-doubt and mistrust around food, often it is this overriding of our hunger cues, but also like a point at which we stop eating. So that's what I want us to explore today. I want us to start looking at your relationship to hunger in a bit more detail, and also your relationship to fullness. And as always, there's a workbook that's going to go along with this. And the first couple of questions that you're going to be asked are around hunger and fullness. So you're going to be invited to look at what is your how do you currently recognise your hunger levels? And then again, how do you currently recognise your fullness levels? So the first thing I want you to do is just start to, I realised I've just not put my microphone on. So hopefully the sound on this video isn't too bad. I'm going to stick it on now rather than go back and record. So first couple of pointers are going to be around how do you recognise your current hunger levels and how do you recognise when you're full. We're going to explore this a little bit more. I'm then going to talk about attunement disruptors. So attunement disruptors are anything that get in the way of you recognising when you are hungry. And a common one is being really busy. Another one is the clock. So many of us have been programmed to eat when the clock says a certain time. Now, of course, structure and routine are really important, but what's also important is that it's a tool. It's that we are not living by that literally. So the second thing for you to do is start thinking about attunement disruptors, can't say that, What are the things that are getting in the way of you recognizing your hunger, but also what are the disruptors that get in the way of you recognizing your fullness? Things like, is it quite stressful when you're sat down and eating? So if you're distracted whilst you're eating your evening meal, let's say, that is going to be an attunement disruptor. It's really hard to recognize your fullness cues when there is chaos going on around you. Also, a belief about finishing everything on your plate might be an attunement disruptor. So just start to give a little bit of thought to what are the things that are getting in the way of you recognizing your biological hunger, but also recognizing getting in the way of you recognizing your biological fullness cues. So once you've done that, there's also some questions that go alongside the attunement disruptors. So just getting you thinking about the impact of those. We're then going to move on to something called the hunger scale. Some of you might be familiar with the hunger scale, okay, but this is such a powerful tool to use to start interrupting the unconscious automatic way most of us actually eat. So today we're looking at hunger and fullness cues, and then tomorrow we're actually going to start looking at something called satisfaction and pleasure. So today it's all about slowing down when you're eating. Now it's up to you how you do this. You can do this each time you go to eat. So it's the first thing is practicing that pause button. Whenever we do anything unconsciously, a bit like writing with our dominant hand, we'll pick up the pen and we'll just write automatically without thinking about it. And what we're kind of saying is actually we want to start writing with our non-dominant hand, and that's unfamiliar, and we'll always go back to the thing that's familiar. So practicing that pause is really key to this, because often what happens when we want to make changes, because we don't allow ourselves time to practice and embed new habits, we get really frustrated with ourselves when we go back to the old habits. But it takes time to move from one thing to the other. So all of these things that I'm sharing over these 7 days, they will require you to practice them, and the more you practice them, the more they start to replace some of the old patterns. So it is important that you kind of have little reminders. I'm a big advocate for putting reminders in my phone. If I don't do that, I don't remember to do things. So it's finding ways where you can remind yourself to practice these techniques. Otherwise, they're just techniques that will go in your rucksack, your toolbox, if you like, and never get used. So the hunger scale, have a little read about what it's about, and then an experiment for you to try. So the first thing is, you can do this each time you go to eat, but if not, just choose 1 or 2 meal times that or recognize it, or when you recognize and you're feeling hungry. So it's about pressing pause, and then what I want you to do is get yourself into the habit of asking yourself how hungry you are. So this is quite nice to start as an experiment. Maybe do a day or so of actually just starting to recognize at what point do you recognize hunger. For a lot of people, it's high on that scale. It's once you get up to the 7, the 8 or the 9. And what happens when we're only then eating when we're already at that higher level of hunger, it's much harder to not be grabbing something quickly. So I know for me, if I get too hungry and I'm cooking tea, the chances are I'm picking at stuff as well, and then I'll eat my tea, or I won't then feel like my tea. So the ideal here with the hunger scale is starting to recognize and eat when your hunger levels are sort of around a 3 or a 4. And it's for a lot of us, if we're only attuned to recognizing hunger when we're much higher on the scale, this is going to take a little bit of practice. We override our hunger cues. So this is about starting to reattune to our biological hunger cues, and it takes time and practice. And so this is a little experiment. It's not about being right or being wrong. It's just about taking time to actually press pause and think about how hungry are you feeling. So we start to actually attune with different hunger cues going on in our body. It's one of those, you need to practice this experiment to sort of have an idea of what I'm talking about. Then on the other side is actually starting to recognize when you are full. So this is when you are actually, you might want to choose a meal time when you haven't got lots of people around, because when you're first practicing this, if you're on your own, it is kind of easier to be more attuned to what's going on. So the whole aim of today is to firstly start to recognize when you're hungry, and to actually kind of check in on that rating scale just to see where you are. And just by giving some attention and awareness to this stuff, it's interesting how you then start to recognize your hunger much sooner. Because if you start to eat when your hunger levels are around a 3 or a 4, you're more likely to have the headspace to decide what it is you actually want to eat. And you're also more likely to recognize when you're fuller much quicker. Not to mention, when we're eating, when we're really hungry, often we're probably grabbing stuff that's higher in sugar, higher in fat, which are often the foods that link into food rules, which then often make us feel guilty. So by practicing the hunger scale and actually attuning to our hunger and starting to recognize our hunger when it's lower on the rating scale, but equally starting to stop eating when we're at a 5, a 6 or a 7, instead of pushing it out to a 9 or a 10 when we're really full. And there are questions around that. So today is all about you giving some time and attention to your hunger levels and your hunger and fullness cues, and to work through the questions to raise awareness of where you're currently at, but then to also have a go at the hunger scale. If there's any questions around applying the hunger scale, come and ask me and I will work through it. Enjoy.